So I want to start by saying that while the title is kind of catchy, so regulating the internet, in a sense it's wrong. I use the word internet very, very broadly in the sense that basically we're talking about services where the particular entity purchasing the services, and these are network type services, maybe has full control of the services being purchased. It may actually have internet access using those same services, and the services are not necessarily to just set up an intranet within your firm, but all of the various activities that you're using these special access services for look like setting up an intranet. And so that's why I felt it's a catchy title. If somebody comes up with something better, then I'm happy to hear suggestions. My first couple of slides will be about engineering things, and I am not an engineer, so everything will be very much in layman's terms. So first of all, special access is defined as dedicated high-capacity connections used by businesses, other institutions, including governments. You can think about school districts, banks, wireless companies, and basically to transmit voice and data traffic that may be highly aggregated from other sources. And so in that respect, special access is considered point-to-point access. The term dedicated is a little bit outdated, but that term stems from thinking about, you've got a pipe. Maybe it's a copper wire, and you're getting, you're paying for access from point A to point B. But actually, in many developed countries, we're basically transitioning from copper to fiber, and the fiber loops and wires can actually take a lot more data. And so in a sense, the appropriate term may be designated rather than dedicated. That is, the company promises you the same amount that you might be able to transmit with a dedicated copper wire using time dimension multiplexing, but actually you're just one packet or a bunch of packets within a very, very large pipe that many other companies are transitioning to.
So you're talking about maybe like the modern equivalent of frame relay services or like MPLS networks?
So I'm not sure what the particular acronym is. I'm terrible with acronyms.
Okay, multi-protocol label switching. It's just a kind of
So
doing
yes,
frame
yes.
relay with, okay.
Right, so the modern equivalent would be packet switched,
Okay.
as opposed to copper,
Right, okay.
as opposed to TDM.
Right.
The term non-switched is, to put it simply, is saying that when you're purchasing one of these wires or access through one of these, you're not necessarily going to directly be able to make phone calls using that. You're not going to have a dial tone. And so that's the layman's term of switched versus non-switched. I think pictures are kind of good. And so the part of this picture that could be termed special access is these, okay, great, you can see this. This channel termination. So what's going on is that customer 2 right here is basically purchasing a DS3 would be a copper wire that connects to the local incumbent carrier's central office, and it may be aggregating various information. It may be used to connect to, this is an oversimplified picture obviously, but it may be used to connect to other branch offices. The customer may also be buying transport to connect between branch offices, and then to be able to connect and transfer data to offices that are far, far away. This may involve interconnection agreements with other network providers but the customer doesn't necessarily see that. The customer is simply paying for a channel termination or transport. There may be multiplexing involved in the sense that maybe the customer has multiple DS1 lines, they're being aggregated to a DS3 line, which can, say, transmit things more efficiently. So traditionally, what you might have used special access for is you're a large business, maybe you set up a call center, and you effectively aggregate all of your phone calls and send them to a modem bank, and then transmit the data using that format. Or alternatively, for a dial-up modem service. Currently, special access is used for a number of purposes. So the title of this presentation is Regulating the Intranet. So here, you can literally think, okay, intranet. So a very, very large enterprise is actually located in many areas. It needs its own secure network, and it buys point-to-point circuits to be able to connect its various branches. A really, really simple example that the FCC likes to put on its website is a bank that connects to its various ATMs. A very, very large customer of special access are wireless providers. And how does wireless work? So you have your cell phone connects to a cell phone tower, the cell phone tower connects to possibly a wired network, usually a wired network. And that wired network, or backhaul, is effectively special access. When I was working in the wireless bureau, I never heard the term special access. We always said, okay, backhaul, it's something that we don't really think about. We look at the competition policies related to the wireless downstream competition. But actually, the FCC regulates the backhaul component, the special access component, quite rigorously, except that the regulatory responsibilities are split to another bureau, wireline. Finally, a very, very large component of special access is actually just wholesale access provision. That is, there is a competing local exchange carrier. The competing local exchange carrier has not necessarily set up a complete network. It interconnects to, or it co-locates on the incumbent's network, and the incumbent is actually purchasing special access to be able to transmit its various data via use of the incumbent's network. But that competitive local exchange carrier might be doing the same type of activities as the incumbent is. It may be, say, a local broadband provider. But effectively, it's a wholesaler. It's just that from the customer's point of view, it doesn't look that way. And the market is actually pretty large, and it has been growing. I will talk about ARMIS a little bit later, but from about 1990 till 2007, the FCC actually forced wireline providers to submit significant data that actually allowed them to track the various special access and various other wireline activities that they were engaged in. And looking at that, I could see that from 1990 to 2007, the special access component of what you might think of as wireline capital expenditures wireline revenue went from 2.6 billion to 18 billion. And you could, by accessing this system, you could get very, very granular data. Unfortunately, since 2007, the FCC's requirements for filing have substantially decreased. It's gotten even worse since 2013, where at some point, even basically medium-sized local exchange carriers no longer had to file, and so there's basically nothing as far as I'm concerned. Although there are some filing requirements, but I haven't been able to find much of the data. Fortunately, the FCC released an order in 2015 starting a tariff investigation that I'll talk about a little bit. And in that order, what they used was preliminary determinations from their ongoing data collection, and that determined that the market is currently approximately 40 billion in revenue, and about 60% of that market is still TDM. So in a sense, it's still copper. And the expectation is that TDM will remain quite important in the United States, at least throughout to the end of 2017. Why is this important? Well, the TDM component of this market is actually the one that's currently being regulated, whereas the FCC has effectively forborne from regulating what we think of as Ethernet-based services. And more about that to come. The economics of special access can be very, very simply put via this picture, where you have a number of fully vertically integrated firms, incumbent local exchange carriers, and you can think about the upstream component of that entity as actually providing the various networks, and many of the costs, at least for the copper networks, are already sunk. And then that entity sells to itself, and that downstream component is the component that deals with consumers and enterprises, but it also sells wholesale access to this downstream competitor too. And that's what you might consider a CLEC. Is there a clock anywhere just to keep track of?
What do you want me to do?
Oh, I just want to get a sense of. Oh, okay, thank you. So I've basically just said what's on this slide. Now, as I've mentioned, regulation really varies based on not only the service, but also based on the geographic market. And the FCC has been looking at special access with proceeding after proceeding since basically the 1990s, although more specifically since the late 1990s. So how is special access actually regulated? So briefly, originally prior to the 1990s, you had cost plus regulation, where effectively CLECs or whatever the regulated company was would submit its costs, and it was effectively allowed to get a certain rate of return. And if that rate of return was, if the ultimate revenue or ultimate profit was such that it was higher than the particular rate of return, then that company actually had to issue a refund to the FCC. In 1990, the FCC determined that this was not creating enough incentive to invest in cost-reducing technology, and so the FCC changed to price cap-based regulation. And then later on, some of the price cap markets were deregulated. So let's just cover each of these things a little bit in turn. So basically, with cost plus regulation, I believe the FCC determined that an appropriate accounting rate of return for the CLECs was, I think it was 11.25, although the number all of a sudden eludes me. The idea behind this accounting determination is supposed to be that this accounting rate of return is supposed to correspond to zero economic profits for the CLECs, for the ILECs. It's not very clear to me how those determinations were made, and I have not gone back prior to the 1990s to make those determinations, and I'm not sure I actually ever want to, especially because those regulations no longer exist. And also, I do believe that many of those determinations were very much effectively made through hand-waving. The problem with this kind of regulation is that the regulated company never really has an incentive to cut costs, because if it cuts costs and increases profits, whatever it gets above that particular accounting rate of return gets appropriated by the commission in terms of actual refunds. There was significant monitoring involved, and that cost of monitoring was also actually important in changing the regulatory regime. And so in 1990, the FCC released an order indicating, okay, we would have price cap regulation. And the idea behind price cap regulation, which I have a very long appendix about, but I think I'll skip it unless there are specific questions about how that actually gets done, is that you set the price cap as equal to eventually something like a consumer-based price index, which is exogenous to the firm. And then you subtract some X factor that takes into consideration things like how fast is technology improving, how fast are costs decreasing in this industry. And so the idea is that if a firm is improving its technology and decreasing its costs faster than the general economy, then until the FCC resets its X factor, then that firm can actually make positive profits above what it would have made using the rate of return regulation that preceded it. When the FCC initially implemented this, it created a very, very complicated system with multiple X factors where above some rate of return, the FCC would still expropriate profits, and if your X factor was such that you were particularly ambitious about how much you could reduce your costs, then the rate of return that you could earn was higher than under an X factor that forced you to be less ambitious. But of course, if you were too ambitious, you could make losses. And in 1995, the FCC realized that, okay, this is still looking too much like previous rate of return regulation. And then eventually, by the late 1990s, the FCC settled for a single X factor, and the focus was very much on creating incentives to reduce costs. There is a caveat, of course. When you're creating incentives to reduce costs, one way to reduce costs is by decreasing quality. And as part of this series of orders, and by the way, these orders were not specific to special access. Special access was one of multiple baskets. But anyway, as part of all of this, the FCC would monitor quality and effectively try to make sure that quality had not been decreasing because of this new regime. In 1999, the FCC introduced what it termed regulatory relief. The idea is that essentially the FCC started with some regulatory regime, and then it transferred to another regulatory regime that is supposed to incentivize people to cut costs. But ultimately, what the FCC would ideally like to see is perfect competition, which is not really possible in these very, very high fixed cost markets. But the point is something that resembles competition rather than having local monopolies. And so then the idea was that in certain areas, and this was certainly true in very urban areas, you would have certain competitors eventually overbuild those areas, and you would at least have duopoly competition, and in certain cases more than that. And in those cases, the FCC determined, okay, well, we don't actually need price cap regulation anymore, and so we could deregulate. And there were two types of regulation, and they were determined by how competitive the FCC felt the area was. In the Phase 1 regulation, how price caps worked is not how an economist normally thinks of price caps, but under Phase 1, it is how an economist thinks of price caps. So typically speaking, as an economist, I think, okay, there's some cap. I can price anything below that cap as long as I don't go over that cap. But that was not the case with the price cap tariffs. Rather, you submitted your series of tariffs over the various different special access products, and that series of tariffs had to be available to all comers. And that's the prices you charged. You couldn't charge lower than those prices. Now, phase one said that, okay, now you could actually have individually negotiated contracts that should still hypothetically be available to all comers, although there are legal and technical difficulties that make that basically impossible. But you could have negotiated contracts where you could set tariffs below the prices that you submit to the FCC. And then finally, in phase two areas where the FCC determined there's a sufficient amount of competition, you could submit whatever prices you want. You still had to submit tariff filings to the FCC. The FCC had to know what's going on. But it could be you can think of a price cap index with multiple products, and previously some prices could be above a certain, say, cap, but the average had to be below the cap. Now the average no longer had to be below. Unfortunately, several studies showed that the FCC's measures of competition were highly flawed. So the particular measures were effectively co-location in the incumbent's wire rate center, with the idea being that if you're co-located, you have access to the incumbent network and you should be able to build out your own network fairly easily because those costs maybe were more reasonable. And so these various studies showed a number of things. They showed that in areas that were still price cap regulated, prices remained, so prices decreased over time. In areas that were not regulated, prices not only increased above prices in price cap areas, which is actually kind of surprising, right? You think that, okay, if it's a competitive area, actually prices should just naturally be below the cap. But also prices increased manifold. So in some of the studies I saw figures of something like prices increasing by over 100% over maybe half a decade.
When you say prices, I mean, how are prices measured? I mean, these are all complicated products.
Right. So you basically have the price cap index. Sorry, not the price cap index. The price index. Mm-hmm. So you take the DS1 price, you take the DS3 price, you take the various. Unis are just completely separate, so I'm not going to confuse people with that. But yeah, you basically look at transport versus channel terminations, and you take into consideration that some of these are two-part tariffs, where some of these services are getting monthly fees, some of these are including some installation fees. So I would actually have to go and look at the specific studies to give you a better answer than that. But yes, you're right. I mean, it's not like, okay, the price of DS1s is increasing. It's more like whatever index the study determined.
Are these FCC studies, or these are independent studies by? So
there was one study that I know was definitely by two FCC economists, except I have to actually get back to you. I didn't think of this until just 15 minutes before the presentation. I realized that actually these two economists might no longer have been working at the FCC at the time of the study. And then there are at least two other studies which I should have written down in the slides, but I'm happy to email you the information. Let's see. So at first the FCC actually resisted because the FCC has a number of orders that it worked diligently to put together with various justifications. But ultimately, the FCC received sufficient pressure, possibly via internal determinations as well, that indicated, okay, they need to revisit this market. And so in 2012 was effectively the beginning of where we are now, which is the FCC suspended its rules for future grants of Phase 1 and Phase 2 regulatory relief. And so providers actually had to submit requests for relief. And then the FCC initiated a large data collection, which it may have already finished, or at least it's in the process of analyzing, because the data arrived in early 2015. And in that data collection, the FCC asks a very, very large number of very granular questions. It asks things about co-location, about where your various rate centers are, who an ILEC is selling to, who a CLEC is buying to, what are the various contracts. The specific fees are actually forced to be tabulated in large Excel or Access or whatever databases. And the idea is that the FCC could look at all of this cost and price and competition data to make a determination of what is the actual state of competition in the various geographic areas, and should we continue granting regulatory relief in some areas? Should we go back and include price caps in areas that have been granted regulatory relief? Should we regulate things like Ethernet in the future? And I don't remember anymore if I put this in my slides, but effectively with regard to Ethernet, between 2005 and I think 2007, a number of forbearance requests for the FCC to forbear from regulating Ethernet were made. I believe that the initial request was actually granted by matter of FCC inaction in time for the deadline to resolve that request. And then I feel like the FCC's hands might have been tied, and then they granted these forbearance requests to the other companies. But given this very large data analysis, the FCC may be able to go back. And other countries, at least I believe the UK does regulate Ethernet special access in the same sense that TDM is regulated. So what is the state of competition? What markets to regulate and to deregulate? What services to regulate? Another ongoing issue has always been updating the X factor, because ideally, if your if you have price cap regulation, eventually, first of all, the particular X factor that you use, that is the particular rate that prices should be expected to fall, that you determined, say, 5 or 10 years ago, is no longer necessarily telling us much about current conditions. And if companies' prices have if companies' costs have fallen drastically, then they're potentially earning what the FCC might determine is super competitive profits. And then there's a question about, okay, how do we then, if we decide to create a price cap, how do we actually put all of these various other services under the price cap, given that these services actually represent a very, very large component of the market? Additionally, there are various, so as Johannes hinted, the set of prices for these services are extremely complicated, and they're guided by a number of tariffs with various discount provisions, particularly applicable for wholesale. And what many CLECs have been complaining about is that these tariff provisions create various lockup, and they're leading to much higher prices than we might get from, say, another CLEC, and that this is preventing us from making enough profit to reinvest that profit and enter the market ourselves. And so then the FCC this last October launched an investigation of 4 of the really large ILECs, and to try to determine what is actually going on here. And so what I've put down for the rest of this presentation is four potential questions for research. 2 of them are purely theoretical, and 2 of them are more applicable in the sense of this is what the FCC is in the middle of trying to find out, and this is what they might want to know from either researchers or from other companies. So the first question, and I think in the interest of time, I won't go to the appendix, is something that I started at the FCC but have not had too much time to work on there, which is a purely theoretical paper about what is the impact of price caps within, and just what is the impact of competition within a partial integration framework, like the framework that very much characterizes special access. And then what happens in that framework if you include the type of price cap regime that the FCC currently has, which is that the price capped incumbent local exchange carriers, their prices to wholesalers, that is to CLECs, are capped at the same rates as retail prices. And what this effectively does is it prevents margin squeezes in the sense that you might have a cap on a retail price, but then you set such a ridiculously high wholesale price that the wholesale price still forces the CLEC out of the market. And so instead, both prices are effectively capped at the same level. My preliminary theoretical findings were just in a fairly simple, I consider it static, except it's 2 stages, so it's technically dynamic framework, is that, first of all, without any kind of price cap regulation, under sets of parameters that might very much look like what's going on in this special access space, where the products are somewhat differentiated, but they're not very differentiated, and CLECs are potentially much less efficient relative to the ILECs. So under these kind of situation, even if an ILEC does not have an incentive without any regulation to exclude the CLEC, the ILEC can create wholesale prices that could lead to price increasing competition, that is, prices that are actually above the monopoly level. Then the second finding is if you include a traditional price cap, that is, so suppose the cap is set at marginal cost. Think of the incumbents' networks as having, the cost of those networks as having been sunk. Then obviously price increasing competition disappears, but at the same time, the incumbents' incentives to serve the CLEC do not diminish relative to a regime without price caps. And so in that sense, price caps could be good. The next very obvious step is, okay, let's look at how investment is impacted for both the CLECs and for the ILECs, and my plan to look at those 2 things is actually going to be somewhat different, and I can elaborate on that later on. The next theoretical question of interest, although this doesn't have to be purely theoretical, is, okay, so the FCC has this ongoing tariff investigation. And what does this tariff investigation imply from an economics standpoint? So from an economics standpoint, the way that I view this investigation is that the CLECs are alleging quantity forcing. That is, with quantity forcing, a provider is maybe, or someone is being forced to buy, or is being induced rather than forced, to buy many more units of a particular product. And the idea behind the particular pricing scheme is such that someone else is kept out of the market. And the traditional way to think about quantity forcing is, suppose you have two sellers and then you have a bunch of buyers. And what one buyer, possibly an incumbent, can do is to create inducements for a large enough proportion of, what an incumbent seller can do is to create inducements for a large enough proportion of buyers such that there aren't sufficient buyers left over for an additional seller to enter the market. Traditionally, this is done through exclusivity contracts, but it can also be done through the type of discount plans that are seen here, where you effectively basically say, okay, you buy 10 units, you get this price, you buy more than 10 units, you get a lower price. The problem is that the allegation here is that the seller who is being kept out of the market is the buyer. Right, so the CLEC is being kept out of the market. It's not having incentives to invest in its network because it's buying so much special access from the ILEC. And so, just thinking about it in my head, I don't see that this is necessarily a sensible argument for the CLECs to make, but it's not completely clear. And I'm sure CLECs would love to see a model that actually can show, well, in theory, quantity forcing can work in this type of market. And I'm just not sure without actually going and doing the research.
But, as an empirical researcher, it strikes me as an unusual question. I mean, wouldn't you ask whether these allegations are actually true in fact, rather than in theory?
Well, this is what the FCC is actually doing.
Okay.
The potential caveat with are they true in fact is that ultimately what the ILECs are alleging is that this just boils down to price, right? We're giving them very low prices already by creating these discounts off the rack rate, and they just want us to give even lower prices. So another very interesting question, and I agree with you completely, is, okay, so how do you actually determine what price levels would actually lead to quantity forcing and what prices wouldn't? And the big problem from an academic standpoint is we don't have access necessarily to the individually negotiated tariff filings. Now, on the other hand, if one were to actually go to, say, a CLEC who is actually dealing with this, then actually there may be a potential mutually beneficial collaboration there. The application questions are, okay, how to reset the X factor. And the problem is, so I mentioned that it used to be that the FCC's methodology for setting the X factor was largely determined by data obtained from the Automatic Reporting Management Information System, ARMIS. And that data is no longer being collected. One approach that you might use publicly available data from, say, BLS or from some other agency, but the problem with much publicly available data is that it groups not just all of the capital expenditures within the particular industry, but, for example, I know that BLS actually groups wireless and wireline. And the current X factor has not been reset in over a decade. And this is kind of an issue for the FCC, and they're very much interested in determining, okay, what can we do? But I don't believe that it's going to be reset personally until the results of the actual data analysis come out. And then finally, how do we incorporate new services? Now, if these new services were just a small component of the overall basket of services that's being provided, then they can actually just be added to the particular index at hand without worrying about the index going over the cap. But if the service comprises 40% or more of the entire market, then it's not very feasible to use the FCC's existing rules for incorporating new services. So one thing that was done in the UK, oh, I'm sorry, no, I wasn't the right set of slides. So one thing that was done in the UK is what's called anchor pricing. And the idea is that you set prices in such a way that when the CLEC is exchanging TDM-based services, so DS1s and DS3s for fiber, whatever you charge for the fiber-based services has to be such that the purchaser is no worse off than he was with the old services. And that might be a way to start a new index for Ethernet services should they be incorporated under the price caps. And so those are 4 questions that I think are very interesting, aside from the broader question that the FCC is trying to do, which is to analyze all of the various data that they've collected and determine what is the current state of competition within special access. Thank you. Obviously, a bigger problem in more rural areas where CLECs are less likely to build out.
That was actually something that I wanted to ask. How does this all connect? Because I'm so deep in rural policies, FCC policies right now, that I couldn't help but think about things like the distance learning and telemedicine program and the E-rate program for schools and libraries. Are those completely taken out of this because that's mainly grant and loan programs, or how does that connect to CLECs and ILECs? And
the scheme of regulations within the FCC is massive. So you've got basically what you're talking about are what was traditionally termed as Universal Service Fund, and then which was in 2011 changed to the Connect America Fund.
Yeah.
And those services are grouped into, I guess, there are largely 4 categories. The 2 that come to mind are actually giving money for like rural providers to actually build out infrastructure, and then money for to connect, say, the urban poor, and then there are programs to connect schools and libraries and so on and so forth.
That's what I was saying.
Now, there is a very, very large number of special access providers that are effectively funded through these kind of programs. So the RBOX, the rural, okay, I can't remember what it stands for. I'm already admitted I'm terrible with acronyms.
RBOX?
Yes.
Regional Bell Operating Companies.
Thank you. Many of these are like very small, or alternatively you've just got these co-ops that are being funded, and they do happen to provide special access in their very, very limited area. And then it happens to be that that set of companies actually does not face price cap regulations. They're still rate of return regulated.
Okay.
And the joke is that these companies represent something like 95% of all of the wireline companies, but serve 5% of the population. Whereas a company like AT&T or Verizon is not going to be receiving Universal Service Fund support, but they're going to be regulated by the special access price caps. But but to answer your question more directly, how does this all relate? Right. So if the FCC finds that there is, say, in some sense, a lack of competition in or competition is more lacking in more rural areas, then this is a reason for possibly reevaluating or stepping up regulation relatively to more urban areas.
Do you think that because of the net neutrality ruling and the idea of now regulating the last mile to the home, that there will be more of the FCC will feel better about moving to regulate Ethernet as well? In other words, okay, the sort of, I know that's a jump, but again, this is an argument that some people are making about states jumping in on regulation because the FCC is past the line in the sand.
So that's, I can't deny your argument. I would say that aside from making a potentially causal argument, there could also just be a separate correlation here where, again, everybody is kind of with the program that fiber is the state of the future, and that if competition doesn't exist to whatever barometer the regulatory agency considers, whether it's the FCC or it's an agency abroad, that you're going to have to regulate fiber. So I don't think it's necessarily driven by net neutrality rules, but your point is definitely taken that the net neutrality rules may give the FCC certain, or not the net neutrality rules, I'm sorry, the Title II regulations of effectively getting rid of this idea of information service is potentially going to be a driver of this. And I think that you might be able to say
they're
this
not
much
getting
more.
rid of information, so the information service category, information service in the Title II, in that Telecommunications Act classification would be something like Facebook or Google, right? They're information services based on the definition of those terms. But where I was going with the telecommunications and these Ethernet services is the logic that the FCC used in the net neutrality order, and the same logic I was talking about before we started, where it is, if you look at the definitions and what the service that's actually being provided, it meets the definition of telecommunications. And that's true for Ethernet-based stuff just like it is for frame relay. The only difference between those two technologies really is one is connection-oriented and the other is connectionless. But that's a technological distinction that has no legal significance. So whether or not, they certainly could deregulate it, but they would have to go through the forbearance process. I mean, at least that's my perspective from reading all of the statutes and the legal history, is that it's a very similar argument. But
right, although Ethernet went through a forbearance process, but actually TDM was not really a forbearance. No, okay, that's not true. In order form, it doesn't look like it's forbearance, but now that I think about it, it is still very much like forbearance because the carrier still has to file with the FCC to ask for deregulation. No, I didn't specify this in my in my presentation, but actually the way that Phase 1 and Phase 2 worked was that there was a line in the sand type of rule where if you could show the FCC that you had over a certain percentage of co-locations with CLECs, then you would get either Phase 1 or Phase 2 depending on the percentage. So it was actually not like a forbearance-based argument.
yeah.
But anyway,
if they did actually
yes.
do the forbearance proceedings, then they could do that.
Right.
They could make it completely unregulated if they wanted. But it
Right, so-
requires a finding of competition. And
Right, and this is the ideal, and it's well, we're going to find out. I don't know when we're going to find out, in terms of when the FCC actually expects to release its findings with regard to the large data analysis. But yeah, I think the FCC will tell us something very interesting with this whole market.
I think we've run out of time unless somebody had a
Can I just ask you a last question? I mean, what I find, I mean, there's you know, for in terms of designing a research project, I mean, there's obviously what empirical questions will happen given the specific ways this approach was implemented. But there's also sort of the the optimal design issues. How would you really structure this to on a going forward basis to achieve goals? And so what I find sort of fascinating is that they set that X factor equal to the inflation rate, in an industry where technology has exponential performance improvements.
Right.
Little by the minute, right? I mean, so
Yeah.
it seems like the wrong.
So this is a huge problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
The other thing is, I mean, the FCC likes to do this. They basically say, oh, in whatever notice of proposed rulemaking they release, we ask commenters for new and better regimes than price caps, or should we go back to rate of return regulation? Should we have some kind of a hybrid between rate of return regulation and price caps? Without necessarily saying anything new.
See, the thing, I think what would be interesting also for the coordinate, if you could put like an international spin on this. I mean, the way I see in a macro view, price cap regulations, right? And this is grossly simplified and sort of doesn't do justice all the intricacies that are involved. But so when Europe started to liberalize these markets, they didn't have any experience with regard to cost accounting and all the regulatory rate plus cost of service design. So they were looking for something that is simple but sort of workable, and so that's why the UK came up with this idea of price caps, right? Something a cap on top, sort of, it's pragmatic, it's simple to do, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to really do it. And then something interesting happened, right? The US thought it was kind of an interesting model, later on adopted it to the US. But in the US you had hordes of accountants and hordes of consultants and hordes of lawyers and engineers who had, tons of data that they could sort of put into this whole model. So in the US, price caps quickly became extremely complicated. I mean, they became very fine-grained and many baskets and many rules and everything. So the whole idea of incentive regulation was sort of thrown overboard. But interestingly, as in Europe, then you get growing numbers of consultants and professors who would make money consulting for people. The same thing kind of happened, right? So the model became more complicated. And that would be sort of maybe something interesting to look at too, right? I mean, by the time you have these more complex designs, you're pretty close to the old cost of service regulatory framework. I mean,
well, so one thing that I completely skipped in the interest of time is basically I have something like 10 to 15 slides about how it actually works.
no.
And incidentally, it's actually all of the formulas originally derived from NIPA, so National Income Product Accounts, and it's basically revenue equals cost, and then taken to a firm. But yes, I actually wonder if the mathematical formulation came before or after the actual implementation. Because the actual implementation seems very simple.
I think the little child's formula came before any derivation. It was literally a pragmatic. You can go back historically. I mean, Stephen Littlechild was the regulator in the US who kind of in England who kind of came up with it. But later on, people pointed out that it was actually inconsistent with basic economic theory. So I mean, like what's his name? Christensen in Wisconsin, the economist. He's an expert in productivity studies. He then pointed out that in order to create consistency, you have to tie it actually to those macroeconomic aggregates.
It's a mess.
To those. So that historically clearly came later, right after the basic idea. And there's 2 or 3 specifications how you can do it. I mean, depending on what kind of indices you use, whether you use an industry-specific index or an economy-wide index. And but so I think in terms of a going forward research project, I mean, those design issues probably would be most interesting ones. I mean, and informed by the historical evidence. And the other thing that you didn't mention that I think is a big issue here. I mean, you mentioned it in passing, is sort of competitive strategies in markets where you can bundle your services in ways, because that seems to be the main tool that the incumbents have available to really prevent competitors from entering the market.
Right. So with the idea being that CLECs believe that special access is where they're making all of this money, and right, they could be bundling special access somehow with unis, which are priced using basically long run costs and are much cheaper. And if you want to get enough unis, you have to purchase. And in fact, I read something fairly recently that in 2005, AT&T even tried to discourage competitors within its contracts from buying unis and asking them to buy special access instead, to prevent them from basically getting these services that were priced at cost. So yeah, I agree. I have effectively, within this presentation at least, completely extracted from the fact that CLECs are buying a horde of services.
Okay, well, we, in the interest of time, we better close, but if, you'll be here, so if other people want to talk to you individually, but this gives me some thoughts as well, and I appreciate your suggestions on ways to go forward. It's the first time I've ever seen a presentation with appendices. So I think it's a great idea. I may adopt that someday, and then...
Oh yeah, so I have hyperlinks in there. And
yes, I got it.
I didn't use them, but...
It's a good idea, though. But
No.
with $50 billion market, there's got to be research.
Only 40.
There's got to be research funding in there somewhere. Okay, but thanks.
Actually.